Chapter 14. The Hidden City. Blinded by spray, Bond felt that he was as good as dead. The enormous flow of water going over the falls set up air currents which acted like an undertow on a swimmer, and he dangled, terrified lest any attempt to throw his feet backwards should destroy his already precarious balance. An updraft carried him away from the lowering clouds of spray, and he saw what had seemed like a bottomless pit was in fact a deep gorge, which sucked in water from 3 of its sides. Ahead of him, beneath a suspension bridge of misty rainbow, the reformed river escaped as a cataract between towering cliffs. Bond's heart fell fractionally faster than the hang glider. A downdraft was carrying him below the lip of the falls. He struggled to find a current of air, but he knew that it was hopeless. He could never reach the surrounding jungle. He would have to follow the river down the gorge and hope that some landing space would appear before he ran out of supporting air. One look at the raging torrent, and his chances of survival seemed remote. The sides of the gorge were sheer save for occasional patches of vegetation, and the river raced through a shattered honeycomb of snaggle-toothed rocks. As the distance to them narrowed, he saw the battered shell of one of the launches breaking apart like a bundle of kindling. That was the fate that awaited him. It was like a nightmare in which with one jolt one is suddenly suspended in mid-air, drifting down, down, down towards a hostile landscape, twisting and turning, but unable to arrest the descent. Bond felt a coldness which did not only come from fear. Beneath the level of the cliffs, the atmosphere was glacial. The rocks glistened with spray, and a bird rose upwards sharply, as if terrified by this strange intruder in its turbulent kingdom. Now the bottom of the gorge was 50 feet away, and all the air seemed to belong to the rushing water. There was nothing Bond could do to stay up, only prolong the agony for as long as possible. A sheer rock face loomed in before him, and he veered away at the last moment, dropping a heart-stopping 10 feet with the suddenness of the turn. Angry spurts of water snapped at his heels, and the gorge closed in above his head. The torrent jinked to the left, and another wall of rock threw itself in his path. Bond forced his right arm up and pulled with his left. As the water rose high to whip against the cliff, he saw a scatter of jagged rocks and stones on the other side of the stream. An untidy mane of creepers strained against the current. Bond veered left away from the full force of the water and braced himself for impact. He came in close enough for the tip of the wing to scrape against the cliff and fell clumsily into the frothing mill race of water. The first impact drove his knees against his chest, and the freezing water cut him to the bone. The battered framework of the glider was torn from his grasp and bounced away like a broken rainbow. Bond narrowly avoided being disemboweled on a submerged rock and snatched at a cluster of creepers. His hands started to slip down the slimy tendrils, stopping at a point to which he clung with desperation born of the threat of imminent death. The current swung him to the side, so that he was within reach of a narrow beach of water-washed shale. Feeling the current relax its hold, he kicked sideways with his feet and threw out an arm to grab at a twist of root which projected from the rock face. His fingers brushed against it and then gripped. A last muscle-wrenching effort, and with both hands clinging to the root, he pulled himself from the maelstrom of pounding water. He lay on the wet stones and sucked in mouthfuls of air, thankful and surprised to be alive. The roar of the water around Bond was still terrifying. Tucked on a ledge of shingle, he seemed almost to be beneath it. As he looked back upstream, the full might of the falls was hidden by the bend in the river, but a thick cloud of spray and mist hung in the air, grey and foreboding against the black mass of rock. The water only needed to rise a few inches to sweep him away again. As if prompted by the terror behind the thought, it began to rain. Bond knew what this could mean. A sudden storm upstream, and the mighty weight of water being swept over the falls would rise by feet in seconds. He began to look around him desperately. The rock swelled out above his head, and before him was an untidy jumble of glistening stones, the residue of a cliff fall. As Bond's eyes reached up, they narrowed incredulously. It was scarcely possible to believe what he could see through the fine net of spray and the falling rain. Revealed through a fading rainbow was a beautiful girl standing on a promontory of rock. She wore a long green robe split to the waist and a headdress like a cap with streamers before and behind the ears. She looked not at Bond, but upstream towards the falls. Bond turned away as the water surged against his foot alarmingly, and when he looked back, the girl had gone. Had she really been there? Had the journey and this terrible gorge begun to play tricks with his imagination? The roar of the water dinned into his ears, and the cold pinched his limbs. If he could not find his way to higher ground within seconds, he would be dead. The rain was now falling heavily, driving in under the rocks. Bond edged along the thin shelf of glistening stones, with the cliff face scraping his back. He could not see what lay directly above him, but his view of the opposite side of the gorge was depressing. A sheer cliff face loomed out like the bow of a ship, pitted only by horizontal contours of erosion. To climb it in his present condition would have been impossible. Bond reached the end of the shale and launched himself clumsily at the lowest of the boulders. The shifting stones made an indifferent springboard, and he was hard-pressed to get a handhold and haul himself up. A glance behind showed him that he had acted only just in time. The small beach had disappeared, and the trailing tentacles of creeper that had saved his life were invisible beneath an angry white froth of wild water. Bond continued to climb, wondering how far the swollen stream could pursue him. Every surface was wet and covered with a green slime that felt like the skin of an eel. The cliffs towered above him like the walls of a deep tomb. He hauled himself up to the spot where he had seen the girl and rested, shivering uncontrollably. At first, he thought he must have been dreaming. He stood precariously on an uneven surface of slippery, rain-lashed rock, with a mass of glistening creeper trailing down the cliff. Then he saw that there was a dark shadow behind the creeper. He tugged the foliage aside and found that he was looking into the mouth of a cave. He pulled out his pencil torch and moved forward. The cave was small, but the torch showed an opening and a flight of rough-hewn steps leading upwards. Bond's heartbeat quickened in excitement. He forgot about the cold and moved swiftly and silently up the steps. He climbed for a long time, his breath visible in the faint light of the torch, until he eventually emerged in a wide tunnel which sloped gently upwards. He followed it stealthily and round a bend to see a glow of light far ahead. Silhouetted in its centre was the outline of the girl. As Bond extinguished his torch and shrank against the wall, she disappeared again. Bond quickened his stride and began to feel the numbing cold losing its grip. The circle of light grew larger and glowed green with sunlight. It was like approaching another world after the watery tomb of the gorge. A few more paces and he was actually able to stand at the mouth of a cave and feel the hot sun playing on his limbs. Above him was an escarpment, and before him the jungle crowded in again, with a profusion of giant cedars, weighed down with flowering creepers. Of the girl there was no sign. Bond stirred himself and pressed forward down a narrow, overgrown path that was obviously rarely used. Where did the girl in the strange costume come from? Bond racked his brains to remember if he had seen something like that costume before. The track opened into a narrow clearing, and Bond found himself face to face with a mass of creeper-covered stones that had clearly once been a building. He looked about him and saw other piles of stones, almost obliterated by the jungle. He had arrived at the ruins of an ancient city. There was a long wall that might have belonged to a public building. There, a well choked by fallen masonry. A row of truncated pillars snapped off like broken teeth, and everything covered by a trellis work of creepers that lay across it like a camouflage net. Bond picked his way between the buildings with difficulty, looking about him for the girl. There was no indication that the place was inhabited. He came out in another overgrown clearing and looked up to the tree line. Poking above the tangle of creepers were the uppermost stones of a building. Bond moved forward warily, brushing through some predatory thorn bushes, to find himself before a squat stone pyramid that soared 100 feet into the air and was stopped by a small temple. A flight of steps led up to the face of the pyramid, and poised in the middle of them was the girl. She did not look at Bond, but there was something about the way she stood, half turned towards him, that suggested she was waiting for him. Hardly had he appeared than she moved forward and disappeared between two enormous stones. Bond felt uneasy, but at the same time fascinated. He looked about him again, and there was no sign of human life. Birds called from the top of trees, and there was the swift, liquid jabber of a monkey. He waited a few seconds, and then crossed to the foot of the pyramid. Q had spoken of the Mayan civilization in the Yucatan. This was what the pyramid reminded him of. And the clothing worn by the girl. Was it possible that some offshoots of the Mayas had been forced to emigrate south because of famine or internal strife? Surely he was not following the survivor of a supposedly extinct race which had somehow managed to propagate itself in the unexplored wastes of the South American rainforests. He started to climb the giant steps and marvelled that stones of this size could have been quarried by handheld implements. Some of the blocks were upwards of 5 feet in height and 12 feet long. Bond reached the spot where the girl had disappeared and found himself at the mouth of a narrow passageway leading down into the heart of the pyramid. On the 2 stones at the entrance were superimposed paintings of warriors with spears. Bond looked beyond them to see the jungle stretching away in all directions, and then stepped down into the interior. Below him was a glow of light, and halfway down the staircase, the beautiful girl. This time she turned to face him, and her face split into a welcoming smile. As if confident that no other invitation was necessary, she turned and continued down the steps. Bond followed. To left and right, the walls were adorned with faded frescoes, showing lines of marching men in short tunics and caps, like the one worn by the girl, but whom Bond now considered his guide. The girl did not look around, but continued down the steps towards the source of light. Bond was keyed up in the knowledge that a great secret was about to be revealed to him. The heart of the enigma must reside in the centre of the pyramid. With quickening pace, he came to the end of the tunnel and looked about him in amazement. His first impression was that he was in a cathedral. Great walls of coloured glass rose into the air and formed the back of the pyramid. Against them pressed the jungle, and the effect of integration was increased by the plants and creepers that climbed to meet the glass from the inside. Crystal rocks glowed as if illuminated internally, and there was a serpentine pool traversed by a silver bridge. Nature had been harnessed, as if in a Japanese garden, but here everything was on a giant scale and less formalized. Beside the arched bridge, the girl waited for Bond like a refugee from a willow-patterned plate, and he had the strange feeling that he was in a world of make-believe. For a chilling moment he wondered if he had perished in the falls and had been wafted straight into a purgatory that obliterated memory. He advanced to the girl and suddenly realized that he had seen her before, at the Vanini glass shop. Now the feeling of being in a dream took on nightmare proportions. The girl started to cross the bridge, and then paused to see that he was following. Something about her look agitated Bond's disturbed mind. The girl was looking, not to see if he was following, but to make sure he was following. Bond started to skirt the pool. The water was clear, the surface merely disturbed by the gentle trickle of a waterfall at its far end. Only an alarmist would have been suspicious. But Bond was an alarmist when it came to the question of life expectancy. He traced the pattern of the paving stones around the pool and spun round as two more figures materialized through the foliage. Girls dressed like the first. Again he recognized them. Astronaut trainees from California. They looked at him with smiling, expectant faces, as if waiting for him to do something. He turned to the first girl. She was still on the bridge. She too was smiling. Waiting. Bond put his foot down and immediately realized that something was wrong. The stone beneath his feet was not anchored, but balanced over a void. Before he could move forward, it sprang into the air and hurled him into the pool. Bond hit the water and straight away struck out for the side. Subsequently, it seemed to him that he had started swimming while still in mid-air. Whoever wanted him in that pool was not thinking of his cholesterol level. His hands had just thudded against the rock when a force like a steel whiplash wound itself around his chest. Bond was plucked backwards and received a terrifying glimpse of what had happened to him. Rearing before his eyes was the hideous open mouth of a giant anaconda. Its coils tightened round his chest, and he started to shout before being dashed beneath the surface. The pressure on his chest might have been exerted by an enormous pair of nutcrackers. It seemed that at any moment his ribcage might break and crush his lungs in a jagged fist of broken bone. Bond struggled and tore with his hands, but the strength of the snake was too great for him. The breath was being systematically choked from his body. Bond took in half a mouthful of water and began to panic. His fingers clawed at the bottom of the pool and closed about a rock. He snatched it up and lashed it at the swaying shape before his face. A blow connected solidly with the anaconda's head, and its grip relaxed. Given new hope, Bond began to fight his way free of the coils. His fingers brushed against the side of the pool. Then the coils snatched tight again, like a contracting spring. The huge weight of the snake bore down on him. Beyond the knot of its coils, Bond glimpsed 10 feet of tail lashing the water like a hose. Twisting desperately, he pushed his fingers into the breast pocket of his tunic. Like a subliminal image, he saw a picture of the retractable pen he had taken from Holly's room in Venice. His fingers closed about the tip, and he drew it out, folding it in his hands. As his tortured ribs seemed to meet beneath the pressure, he forced the point of the pen against the straining flesh of the snake and pressed the tip. Seconds passed, but nothing happened. The grip did not weaken, and the snake was still trying to force his mouth open so that he would drown. Then, suddenly, the coiled body was a weight that had no strength. Bond wriggled free and felt his ribcage expand. The snake hung in the water as if in suspension. It gave 3 convulsive twists, and then lay still. Bond swam to the side of the pool and hung on, breathing painfully. He then hauled himself out and closed his eyes as he cleared his lungs. When he opened them, it was to see a small mountain of wet leather against his face. The leather, which gleamed dully, belonged to the toe cap of a shoe. Above the shoe was a tree trunk of sodden material that formed a trouser leg. Above the trouser leg was Jaws. His mouth was open, and his teeth parted in a grin that shone down like a naughty deed in a naughty world. Bond rested his head on his hands and regularized his breathing. Something told him that he was going to need every ounce of breath that he could find. "Mr. Bond." The voice echoed down from above and conveyed a note of genuine regret. "To defy all my attempts to plan an amusing death for you." Jaws' hand reached down and picked up Bond as if he was a floating toy being retrieved from a bath. With disdainful ease he dumped him down before the owner of the voice. Drax appeared down a flight of steps from what had presumably been a vantage point on a high rock. "Why did you break off the encounter so summarily?" "I discovered he had a crush on me," said Bond. Drax brushed the front of his black silk tunic as if picking off Bond's remark like a speck of dust. "Always jokes, Mr. Bond. A concomitant of the stiff upper lip, I suppose. The Englishmen always laugh in the face of adversity. Well, I can promise you plenty to laugh at. It will be interesting to see if your sense of humour can keep pace with it." He nodded to Jaws and turned on his heel. Jaws thrust out a hand, and Bond staggered forward. The familiar faces of two more girls had appeared, and he noticed that they shared a common expression with the first three. Disappointment. "I'm sorry about your pet," said Bond. The girls looked at him coldly and followed on like bridesmaids at a wedding. Drax led the way towards heavy metal doors that slid open at his approach and revealed a scene totally in contrast to the conservatory calm of the glass chamber. Tiers of technicians sat before ascending screens of overprinted monitors, and the sound of disembodied voices calling out technical information rang out like those of brokers in a stock market. Bond quickly saw that all the monitor screens had one thing in common. They revealed different stages of rockets being prepared for takeoff. Rockets that were clearly intended to propel something into space. Bond watched giant claws swing slowly back from the winged spacecraft and saw the familiar lettering on the hull. Moonraker. Fresh words and symbols continuously flooded on the flickering screens, and Bond realized that he was watching the pre-launch procedure, not for one, but for several space shuttles. He turned to Drax, who was looking about him like a bishop in a newly consecrated cathedral. "What the hell are you up to here, Drax?" Drax did not deign to look at him. One of his brutish hands rose and plucked reflectively at the red fur on his face. "It is a convention of the fiction beloved by parlourmaids that the villain explains all before disposing of his victims. I do not intend to follow that precedent." "Not even the briefest elucidation, Drax?" Drax turned away from the hustle and bustle of the control chamber and looked towards a domed glass case resting in an alcove. In Victorian days it would have contained an arrangement of small, brightly coloured stuffed birds. Now it held a beautiful black orchid, its flowers tipped with scarlet as if they had been dipped in blood. Bond recognized the slide he had been shown in Q's workshop. Orchidacea nigra. Under Jaw's watchful eye, Bond moved to Drax's side. "What about that orchid?" Drax spoke as if to himself. "The curse of a civilization. It was neither pestilence nor war that wiped out the race who built the great city lying around us. It was their reverence for this lovely flower." Bond looked again at the bland face of the orchid. Behind its sheen of surface beauty there was an impression of evil conveyed more subtly than through its colour. The very shape of the flower suggested that of a praying mantis. "Come too near me, and I will devour you," it seemed to say. Even within the heart of the flower there was a tiny fetal face, crushed so tight that it seemed to be crying out in pain and despair, as if bemoaning a life it could never have. "The flower is poisonous," said Bond. "In the long term, yes," said Drax. "Exposure to its pollen causes sterility. The unfortunate Mayans never realized that. Through every crisis of their dwindling civilization, they took to worship the flower that was responsible for its destruction. Poignant, is it not?" "But you've improved on sterility, haven't you, Drax?" Drax smiled. "If you choose to employ such quaint phraseology. Yes, I have. As you probably observed in Venice, those same seeds now yield death. Except to animals, and plant life as well." Drax spread his hands. "One must preserve the balance of nature. Let no one say that at heart I am not an ecologist." His smile was like a crack on a gravestone. "Moonraker launch program now commencing." The voice coming over the public address system temporarily drowned the babble of voices flooding the chamber. Drax raised his eyes to one of the screens, and Bond followed them. "You have arrived at a propitious moment, Mr. Bond." The voice was a contented purr. Bond saw a wide expanse of Arctic ice cap. There was no sign of a human presence. Another voice cut in. "Moonraker 1, Liftoff." Immediately the ice cap shattered, and the screen flooded with light. Through the light appeared the nose cone of a rocket, and attached to it a Moonraker shuttle. The assembly rose slowly into the air, and then roared skyward, leaving a dense trail of smoke and flames. The picture changed instantly to a barren stretch of desert. "Moonraker 2, Liftoff." A chatter of technicians' voices orchestrated the appearance of a second rocket and shuttle. The final stages of the countdown flashed up on the screen, and monitors around the chamber fed back changing temperatures and pressures. Bond glanced towards Jaws. He was watching the scene, round-eyed and open-mouthed, like a child looking up at an illuminated Christmas tree. "Moonraker 3, Liftoff." Now the picture changed to a range of mountains, and a third rocket and Moonraker soared into the air. Bond's awe was nearly the equal of Jaws, but coupled with it was a growing sense of alarm. Why were these shuttles being put into orbit? What was Drax planning to do with them? All the time, at the back of Bond's mind, was the image of what he had seen at the glassworks. The two scientists sliding to the floor, their hands clutching at their throats, the rats squeaking in their cages. Bond glanced about him and saw that both Jaws and Drax were absorbed by what was happening on the screens. He started to edge sideways, but felt something hard press into his ribs. A guard with a submachine gun prodded him back painfully. Drax addressed Bond without turning his head. "I understand your desire to leave us, Mr. Bond. In fact, I endorse it. However, you will go when I wish it. My genius demands the respect of a little attention." Bond read the message on Jaws' gleaming teeth and turned back to the screens. He was now looking at a Pacific atoll. Palm trees shuddered and then disappeared from view as a dazzling effulgence blazed across the monitors. Bond was reminded uneasily of another Pacific atoll. "We have liftoff," said a satisfied voice over the public address system, and the blazing tail of a rocket disappeared out of the top of the picture. A dense cloud of smoke began to clear, and the agitated palms stopped having hysterics. The screen suddenly went blank. "4 shuttles in space?" queried Bond. "6, said Drax shortly. He turned towards a technician sitting before a cathode ray tube on which circles of light were converging towards a glowing center which throbbed at 1-second intervals. The technician spoke into a chest microphone. "Moonraker 5 on preset launch program, -10. The countdown began to be projected onto the console in electronic script as another technician spoke into his microphone. "Moonraker 6 on preset launch program, -20. Bond turned to Drax. "Tell me one thing. The Moonraker that was on its way to London and disappeared over Alaska. You hijacked it, didn't you?" Drax's eyes roamed the monitors. "You use the language of the tabloids, Mr. Bond. Let us say I repossessed my own property. It was a regrettable necessity. One of the Moonrakers I was intending to use in this program developed a technical fault. I was not prepared to put the timing of the operation back." He looked at Bond, and a quick dart of red flashed in his eyes. "As you know, I am not renowned for my patience." "And what is the operation?" Drax held Bond's glance for a couple of seconds, and then shook his head brusquely and dismissively. "No, Mr. Bond. You have distracted me enough." He turned to Jaws. "Mr. Bond must be cold after his swim. Place him where he can be assured of warmth." Jaws showed half an inch of grinning metal, as if sharing a private joke, and propelled Bond towards a ramp leading deeper into the pyramid. Bond turned to face his captor. "I'll see you later, Drax." The voice was a razor wrapped in velvet. "Fleetingly, perhaps. Mr. Bond. At the end of the ramp was a network of dimly lit corridors, and Bond felt Jaws' hand grip his arm and force him towards a heavy wooden door, fortified by horizontal pieces of metal. The pressure of the grip told him that there was no point in trying to escape. 2 bolts were slid back, and the door opened just wide enough to receive Bond's body. With a thrust of Jaws' arm, Bond was making acquaintance with the opposite wall, whilst the door slammed behind him. "James!" Bond turned to find Holly launching herself towards him. He caught her by the shoulders and looked into her eyes. "Thank God you're all right." "You are all right, apart from a few bruises. And you?" "The same." He looked around the high vaulted chamber, furnished with a large circular table, surrounded by chairs. It looked like an exclusive boardroom, but without windows. "Where the hell are we?" "I don't know. I haven't moved since they brought me here." Bond looked up at the ceiling, far above their heads. It was almost as if they were at the bottom of a well. Drax is launching 6 Moonrakers. 4 have gone already. "Do you know why?" "I was going to ask you." Holly shook her head. "Where are the other 2 shuttles?" Bond started to prowl around the room. "I think they must be somewhere near here. We've got to get out and locate them." "Let me spare you the trouble, Mr. Bond." The voice belonged to Drax and echoed down eerily from above. At the same instant, the ceiling above their heads split open and began to slide back. Bond sucked in his breath. He was looking at the menacing barrels of 7 mighty rocket engines. A Moonraker space shuttle, with its propellant tank and booster rockets, was positioned vertically above their steep-walled prison, supported by giant metal arms. Bond understood Drax's remark to Jaws about putting him where he could be assured of warmth. Holly and he were inside the exhaust chamber for launch rockets. Enormous panels in the roof of the pyramid slid back to reveal the sky far above, distant as the hope of escape. "Even in death, my munificence is boundless." Drax's blunt silhouette loomed over the edge of the pit. His hands lathered air smugly. "When this rocket lifts off, I shall be leaving you in your own private crematorium." He raised an arm, and an elevator began to descend from the opening in the cabin of the Moonraker. "Dr. Goodhead, Mr. Bond, I bid you farewell." He delivered a mocking salute and climbed into the elevator. With a remote, whining whir, it began to lift into the air. Bond looked at the rocket barrels of death, thinking of the billowing clouds of flame he had seen emerge from big rocket engines. When Moonraker 5 lifted off with Drax in it, they would be reduced to ashes within seconds. "Moonraker 5, 4 minutes to liftoff." The technician's voice rang out like that of a mortuary assistant. Bond avoided Holly's desperate eyes and reverted to looking around the walls of the chamber. The atmosphere was not stuffy, despite the apparent lack of ventilation. He started to push a steel cabinet along the wall. "What is it?" Holly looked at him keenly. "Do you think we can climb out?" "Not up that wall. I'm looking for an air shaft." He dropped to his knees as he found a square opening in the wall, a foot from the floor. He squinted through the criss-cross of metal bars and saw that there was in fact a narrow shaft, perhaps 30 feet in length. Beyond it, jungle foliage showed temptingly. Bond seized the bars and gritted his teeth. He strained until the sweat ran down his cheeks, but the bars did not budge. Holly knelt beside him with hope dying in her eyes. 3 minutes to lift off." Maybe it was Bond's imagination, but there seemed to be an edge of mockery in the technician's announcement over the public address system. The metal arms were drawing back one by one from the rocket, and the elevator and its movable shaft had retreated out of the view of the pit. Most sinister of all, thin wisps of gas were emerging from some of the rocket engines, as if from the bowl of a pipe. The whole structure of the rockets began to hum with activity. "You can't move it?" Bond did not reply, but pressed Holly's back against the wall. His fingers fumbled with his watch, and Holly saw what looked like a winding device being detached from its side. Behind it was drawn a thin thread, as if a spider was descending from its web. Bond knelt and swiftly pressed the small circle of metal against the point at which one of the bars emerged from the wall. There was an almost imperceptible click. The metal roundel adhered. Bond waved Holly farther along the wall and moved to take up a position beside her. The watch was still playing out thread.
2 minutes to liftoff.
The technician's voice could now barely be heard above a low whining noise that was emanating from the rocket and increasing in intensity with every second. The stench of turbine exhaust fumes scraped at their throats. Bond pressed his back against the wall and his hand moved to his watch. Holly looked first at him with an ironic questioning in her eye and then down to the thread. Are we supposed to pull? Push. Bond's finger jabbed against the watch, and a pinpoint of red light flashed up the thread. There was a violent explosion, and a cloud of smoke billowed from the mouth of the shaft. Bond started forward as the severed fuse retracted into his watch. The grill had been blasted aside. Only a few stubs of metal remained. Bond gestured towards the opening. "Get in!" His eyes were watering, and he started to choke. Fumes swirled around him. The whole structure of the rocket was beginning to throb. The metal arms had swung back out of sight. The disembodied voices of the public address system intoned the critical stages of the countdown.
1 minute to liftoff.
The knell of doom rang in Bond's ears as he scrambled into the shaft and started to crawl after Holly. In less than 60 seconds, a merciless tongue of flame would be pursuing them, roasting them alive as if they were threaded on a spit. A stub of metal took a chunk out of his knee, but he hardly noticed it. Behind him he could hear the noise building up towards ignition. The eldritch screech developed into a giant roar. He blundered against Holly's heels and shouted at her to go faster. His knuckles were bleeding. Holly's body shut out the air and light. He could see nothing before him. With a fresh pang of horror, he realized that the shaft was narrowing. His shoulders brushed against rock on the other side. There must be still another 15 feet to go. At that moment, he was convinced they were never going to make it.
10, 9, 8.
Somewhere behind them, the referee was calling the count over a fallen fighter. Bond imagined the blowtorch of flame rushing up between his legs and wanted to cry out in horror.
6, 5.
Ahead of him, Holly suddenly disappeared. He saw a square of green light and another shaft joining at right angles the one they were in.
3, 2, 1. Ignition. Liftoff.
Bond forced himself forward, following Holly into the side tunnel. Barely had he pressed into the opening than a rush of orange flame roared past, making him scream with pain. He heard the noise of his hair singeing and smelt the scorched fabric of his clothing. The pain was agonizing, and for several seconds he thought he was going to die. Then the flame disappeared as suddenly as it had come, and there was only a wisp of acrid smoke. Somewhere in the distance a great roar swelled and then died away. Bond touched his burnt flesh and winced. Pieces of charred material were sticking to him, and he had no idea how badly he'd been injured. "James," Bond urged Holly forward. "Keep going. I'll be all right." He gritted his teeth against the pain and tried to find some comfort in the fact that at the side of the shaft, somewhere near them, was a source of light and air. It was revealed as a grill giving onto a ledge of rock. The light was artificial and came from a lamp attached to the rock beside the grill. Bond heard the sound of a motor vehicle going past, and then another. The public address system was barely audible in the distance. Bond surmised that they must be in some tunnel leading off the control chamber. Holly waited at the grill whilst Bond attacked it with his bleeding fingers. This one was a wire mesh construction that could be easily forced open. He crawled out onto the rock and lay still, feeling the unbelievable balm of cool air against his cheeks. Slowly, some semblance of life returned to his cramped limbs, and with it, the responsibility of action. So far, nothing had been achieved save the salvation of their own lives, but Bond had seen enough to know that many others' lives were at stake.
Moonraker 6 preset launch program completed. Pilots proceed from base to launch area.
The announcer's voice was faint but distant. Hardly had it finished speaking than an open vehicle came into view beneath Bond's perch. In it, sitting back to back along the length of the vehicle, were 12 of the astronauts that Bond had seen being trained in California. 6 men and 6 women. They were wearing white tunics, and for an instant their faces showed grim and purposeful in the lamplight. The vehicle rolled on its way. Come on. Bond forgot about the pain of his burns and scrambled down the side of the rock to the broad passageway. He held up a hand for Holly, but she was already beside him. From the direction from which the astronauts had come was the sound of another vehicle approaching. Bond nudged Holly. Stand by. We may be hitching a lift. A jeep appeared down the track, and the sight of 2 passengers sitting behind the driver made Bond's heart skip a couple of beats. They were wearing the operational suits of astronaut pilots, carrying helmets and visors. Bond leapt in front of the vehicle and flung his arms wide. The amazed driver stood on the brake, and the jeep skidded to a halt. What the hell do you think you're doing? The driver's spontaneous reaction came split seconds before he realized that there was something wrong with Bond's appearance. By that time, Bond had walked calmly round to the side of the jeep and hit him on the point of the jaw. As he slumped backwards, Holly snatched up the submachine gun that lay beside him. The 2 pilots, handicapped by their cumbersome uniforms, hardly had time to get over their surprise before they were knocked senseless by a karate chop from Bond and an expertly aimed blow with the butt of a gun from Holly. Bond dragged the driver from the wheel, and Holly jumped into his place to drive the vehicle into a dark alcove. She cut the engine, and Bond looked at her admiringly. Right, he said. I estimate we have about 5 minutes. 4 minutes later, the jeep pulled out of the alcove, with 2 figures in astronaut pilot uniform in the front seat. It trundled down the broad passageway, and within the space of a few minutes, after a tiny hesitation at an intersection, emerged from the dark tunnel into a brightly lit chamber that throbbed with activity. At one end, rearing majestically, was Moonraker 6, with its attached fuel tank and rockets to take it into space. Resting against the structure like protective fingers were curved steel girders. They opened in unison as the jeep appeared from the tunnel. The huge rockets were trembling and beginning to make the high-pitched whining noise that had characterized the pre-liftoff build-up of Moonraker 5. The mobile elevator against the cabin entrance to the space shuttle was beginning to make its descent. A door over the passenger hold slid closed, and the vehicle that had been transporting the 12 astronauts reversed beneath the gantry. 2 armed guards stepped forward, and one of them raised his arm as the jeep approached the descending elevator. He held out his hand, and for a few seconds neither the driver nor his companion did anything. Then the driver raised his hand to the breast pocket of his uniform and produced an identity card with photograph attached. His companion followed suit. The guards glanced at his card. You guys are cutting it fine, aren't you? Did you stop for a leak? The driver nodded and stretched out his hand for his card. The guard hesitated for a moment and then returned the cards. He stepped back and the jeep continued to the waiting elevator. Above it, the combined structure of the spacecraft and its boosters towered into the air, almost scraping the ceiling of the chamber. There was a grinding noise, and the roof opened to reveal a diamond-shaped patch of blue sky. The 2 pilots stepped from the jeep and entered the elevator. With a hiss of compressed air, it left the ground. 2 pairs of eyes looked about them warily. Behind the glass of the control room monitors, screens and consoles flashed up pictures, figures and print-out messages. The unceasing interplay of voices droned across the open space, to be heard above even the whining of the rocket turbine pumps, which set the teeth on edge.
4 minutes to lift off.
The elevator quivered to a halt before the open hatchway of the Moonraker control cabin, and the 2 figures in pilot uniform raised an arm towards the control room like footballers acknowledging their support before the start of a game, and ducked down to enter the shuttle.
3 minutes to lift off.
The first pilot climbed into a padded seat, strapped himself in, and pressed a button that tilted the seat so that he was facing in the direction in which the Moonraker would be travelling, his back horizontal to earth.
2 minutes to lift off.
The door hatch slid shut, and there was a hissing noise as it sealed hermetically. Bond turned towards Holly, who was strapping herself in beside him. Holly quickly flashed out an arm to flick off a switch. "Don't say anything. We're on a closed circuit until after liftoff." Bond nodded and Holly's voice relaxed. "We won't have to do anything. We're on a pre-programmed flight pattern." She quickly flicked up a switch, and Bond could hear again the uninterrupted sound of the countdown.
10, 13, 12, 11.
Bond folded his hands against his chest and gazed at the banks of dials and flickering needles. Everywhere there was vibration, movement and noise, and above the terrifying roar of the fuel pumps getting ready to prime the engines for ignition.
8, 7, 6, 5.
Bond suddenly felt frightened, a fear that was physically painful. He was about to be shot into space, with no idea of his destination or what would happen to him when he arrived. If he arrived.
3, 2, 1. Ignition. Liftoff.
Bond's shoulders bent to the curvature of his seat. He sensed the rocket detach from its mooring and began to lift slowly into the air. Through the cabin windows he could see fumes and dust billowing up. The control room was obscured. Within seconds, he would be exposed to the mind-scrambling stress of the G-force that had nearly taken his life on the centrifuge trainer. The needles on the control panels danced madly. The speed started to build up. His stomach felt as if it was being pushed down his body at the end of a hot metal rod. James Bond closed his eyes.